Welcome to Sunday Sermons from the Williamsburg Community Chapel, brought to you by the Chapel Podcast Network. Let's grab our Bibles and open up to the book of Mark, chapter 8, verses 27 through 38. And I'll read verses 34 through 37 for us now, as we prepare to hear from me, Luke Kincaid, as I get to help us continue in our summer sermon series titled, The King and the Kingdom. And calling the crowd to him with his disciples, he said to them, "If anyone would come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. For whoever would save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for my sake and the gospel's will save it. For what does it profit a man to gain the whole world and forfeit his soul?" Our late pastor emeritus, Dick Woodward, served here from 1980 to 2014, loved to ask people he met with or counseled one question in particular, and that was, who are you? He felt that this single question is one of the most important ones that we could answer, because he would say that either a no to that question or the wrong answer to that question is one of the greatest reasons people struggle with personal unhappiness. Now, I'm grateful that I had the opportunity to know Dick Woodward, and I got to meet with him on a weekly basis when I did the pastoral internship here at the chapel. So I remember thinking about this question with him, and then in preparation for today, rethinking about this question, who are you? Who is Luke Kincaid? An obvious starting point would be my name, Luke. So when you hear that name, what are a couple obvious other Lukes that I could be named for? Feel free to shout them out if you want to. Someone knew my middle name. That was impressive. So the big ones are Luke Skywalker, for those Star Wars fans. So I early on embraced a love of Star Wars. I even wore Star Wars socks today. Got Baby Yoda on here to show that, yes, my name is Luke, and you either have to hate Star Wars or really like it, and so I've embraced it with the name Luke. And then, of course, the other one is the gospel writer Luke. And I still don't really know which one I was named after. My parents come here. I think they're in the first service, though. If you see them, you can ask them. It may depend on which one you ask, which one I was named after. I like to think it's both. And so that's maybe where my name, it's not a family name. It's one of those two. And of course, when you meet someone, this is one of the first things you do. You share your name. And you can learn a little bit about somebody from their name, some of their heritage, maybe the meaning of their name if it applies to something in their life. But there's much more to a person than just their name. So I can list all the things that I like to do. I like to coach soccer. I used to like playing soccer. Now I coach soccer. I play fantasy football. I try to take on Walt Johnson on the golf course. He's a congregant here. Or I could tell you that I went to Jamestown High School and UVA for college. Or I can tell you my wife's name is Alexis, and we have two daughters, Mackenzie and Finley. All interesting things about me, but still pretty surface level. All those things do describe me on some level, and they're helpful in understanding who I am. But I think the better questions to answer when thinking about who are you are, what are my motives, my intentions? What are the expectations that come with those things? One way people have worked to try and get at the underlying motivations or personality traits that drive people to act or behave in certain situations are personality tests or inquiries or those kinds of things they like to do when you join a job or when you go to a camp or things like that. So a big one for years, and it's still used a lot, and I remember taking it when I first came here, is the Myers-Briggs test. Although I hear I'm not supposed to call it a test. Someone came up to me and they said, I forget the word she used, but she's like, they don't like it calling it a test. So the Myers-Briggs personality inventory, maybe that was the word. Myers-Briggs. And so I learned early on that I am an ENTJ. Are there any other ENTJs? Oh, Carol, okay, got a couple. We're a fairly rare category, but the ENTJs stands for extrovert, intuitive, thinking, judging. Steve Jobs is a famous ENTJ, so whether you like him or not, I don't know if I'm in good company, but Steve Jobs is one of them. A newer personality model, well, it's old, but come back into fame, is the Enneagram model. So for those that like the Enneagram, I am a 7 on the Enneagram. Any other Enneagram 7s for those that like that? Tends to be my age category. Oh, there, I got one up there. So the 7 is the enthusiast, which means I love new adventures and showing them to other people, and generally motivated by a desire to be happy and not deal with uncomfortable feelings. Personality tests like these are helpful because they try to get at the root causes, right? Or motivations that a person has in their life. They're great and can be very useful tools in getting to know your coworkers or family or yourself. But even these tests don't paint the whole picture, hence why there are so many of them. One thing that I notice in terms of understanding ourselves is that our true self often comes out when things don't go the way we want, or something happens that's unexpected. We have to face hard truths about ourselves and see our true motives come to light. In fact, I want you to take a moment and think about a time when you felt disappointment. I did this exercise for myself this past week, and of course, there were some small daily moments of disappointment that came to mind, which do give us insight into our motives on a daily basis. But I want you to let your mind come to one of those moments that you felt disappointment on a larger scale. These don't happen as often, maybe a few times in your life. But as I tried to think about these bigger identity-shifting moments of disappointment, there are a few that came to mind. And one of them happened on my trips with the student ministry program to the country of Nicaragua. Now, the trips themselves were not a disappointment. They were wonderful. But my outlook on the world and the sobering reality of the poverty that existed there led me to disappointments. Nicaragua is a country where 30% of the country lives below the national poverty line, which in Nicaragua is defined as $2.50 per day. A country where I saw a community of people that chose to live in the city trash dump because the only way they felt they could sustain their life were to pick bottles or other things and try to sell them. These moments are where I experienced disappointment on many levels. Disappointment on a worldwide scale, wondering if the rest of the world cared about a place like this. I was disappointed on a national level, knowing that selfish people turned a blind eye to the poverty in their own country. I was disappointed on a personal level because I knew that part of me at times thought myself, I might be better than these people. I was disappointed because I knew that I complained regularly about petty things, like what I had to eat or what I had to wear. And yet there were people right in front of me who made their livelihood off of trash heaps. Now, these levels of disappointment are not unique to Nicaragua, but they are ones that I didn't like, I don't like, and ones that I started to wonder maybe define me sometimes more than my successes even, or accomplishments, or achievements. Or at the very least, we have to consider them as we try to understand who we are. So this experience began to shape that question of who I am, forced me to ask questions about my purpose and my contribution to the greater good. Some good questions to figure out on the path to discovering the real you. Then a few years after my trips to Nicaragua, I got married. One of the things that I often say in my marriage homily to other couples that I officiate their weddings for is that if the goal of marriage is oneness, we often spend the rest of our life then trying to figure out, well, which one are we going to become? I quickly realized that I fall into this trap as well. My own selfishness and pride tends to think that, of course, my view of the world, our family, the way towels should be folded, or the dishwasher stacked is the proper way. And so my wife, Alexis, should clearly concede and become more like me. It doesn't take very long in a marriage to realize how selfish you really are. Marriage is a clear picture, a clear mirror, for their true motives. It's a clear mirror for understanding who you are. I think we all have to be honest about our own selfishness, our tendency to drift towards self-pleasure or self-centeredness when left to our own will and desires. And I think this is a human nature problem and one of the root issues that we have to consider as we answer this question, who am I? And I think our passage this morning gives us a good picture of what God's plan for discovering the real you looks like. So let me reread a few of the verses that Aiden read just to reorient us back to them. Jesus said, if anyone would come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. For whoever would save his life will lose it. But whoever loses his life for my sake and the gospel's will save it. For what does it profit a man to gain the whole world and forfeit his soul? The word there for soul and life are the same underlying original Greek word. And this word is trying to really get at who you are. The late pastor Tim Keller, who's the pastor up at Redeemer Presbyterian Church in New York, a wonderful teacher and a helpful theologian, puts the definition of this word for soul or life this way. The deliberately chosen Greek word here is psyche, from which we get our word psychology. It denotes your identity, your personality, your selfhood, what makes you distinct. Or in my own words, the real you, the person that God created you to be, the version of you that brings life to the full. This is what the author Mark wants us to think about when he asks, for what does it profit a man to gain the whole world and forfeit his soul? I think this passage gives us the guide for how to discover the real you. The first step of this is the side of dealing with that self, that selfishness. This is where the verses say we must deny ourselves or lose your life, where's the language used in the Mark passage. And the way I like to put it that'll tie in with our big point or later is discovering the real you requires you to lose the fake you, give up the fake you found by following fake kings. Now, what do I mean by this? I actually think a great place to start is at the beginning of the passage we read, because we get a glimpse at one of the disciples having to deal with this and right in front of Jesus. And his name is Peter, and most likely, I don't actually know what he would be on the Enneagram scale, maybe an 8. So if you're an 8, maybe you relate to Peter in this story. But let me read the beginning again for us. Jesus asked, who do people say that I am? And they told him, John the Baptist, others say Elijah, and others one of the prophets. And he asked them, but who do you say that I am? Peter answered him, you are the Christ. And he strictly charged them to tell no one about him. Then he began to teach them that the Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders and the chief priests and the scribes and be killed, and after 3 days rise again. And he said this plainly. And Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. But turning and seeing his disciples, he rebuked Peter and said, get behind me, Satan, for you are not setting your mind on the things of God, but on the things of man. Now, I think Peter's intentions actually seem okay at first. They have just proved that they correctly have identified Jesus as the Christ. This was an Old Testament concept. Old Testament told the Jewish people of the time to expect someone that they called a Christ, or it just can mean a king, to come. And Jesus was the fulfillment of that. They've been looking, and he was here. This was a high point for the disciples because Jesus just affirmed that they had figured it out. No one else had figured it out, but the disciples had. However, then Jesus begins to talk about things like suffering and dying and being rejected. And Peter and the other disciples most likely thought Jesus was wrong or had a misunderstanding about what it meant to be the king, this coming king, the Christ they were all waiting for. Jesus had just told them they were correct to call him the expected king from the Old Testament. And they knew him on a level that no one else did. And so they wanted to make sure Jesus wasn't going astray or would actually follow through with what it meant to be the Christ, to fulfill the promises of the Old Testament. They may have even thought Jesus was testing them to see if they knew the Old Testament. However, the problem is that human nature, unaided by God, can sometimes have good intentions, but the wrong underlying reasons or bad information or misinterpretations that inform those intentions. They didn't understand the Old Testament correctly, and Peter missed the mark. He improperly rebukes Jesus and then gets corrected by Jesus in front of all the other disciples. Jesus tells us that Peter was setting his mind on the things of man rather than the things of God. Peter was hoping for a conquering king. And I think maybe he was even selfishly looking forward to being this conquering king's right-hand man, that they could go up against the Romans and really show them who's boss for the first time, and he was going to get to be a part of it. The difference between the things of man and the things of God can sometimes be tricky. And human nature, unaided by God, can be quite convincing, which is why I think Jesus uses such strong language when he talks about the first step to discovering the real you comes through self-denial or losing yourself. Peter didn't even realize that he had been incorrectly and unhelpfully following the guidance of other men's thoughts, those fake kings. He had part of the picture correct, but still hadn't fully embraced the true depth of his self-deception. Jesus even calls him Satan. Now, a great author that many of us have read and we quote a lot is a guy named C.S. Lewis. One of his books that is a great read called Mere Christianity. The last chapter is called The New Man, and it has a great chapter describing this transformation that we see Jesus talking about. And I really like the way he describes the understanding of ourselves that we all fall into the trap of. So let me read this. In fact, what I so proudly call myself becomes merely the meeting place for trains of events which I have never started and which I cannot stop. What I call my wishes become merely the desires thrown up by my physical organism or pumped into me by other men's thoughts or even suggested to me by devils. I am not in my natural state nearly so much of a person as I like to believe. Most of what I call me can be very easily explained. Lewis is saying that we often think of ourselves as really unique or original and having the ideas that we need to impose upon other people or we need to get from someone else. But in fact, a lot of our instincts can be described based on the influence of others or certain chemicals in our body or big events we don't control. So the self we try to hold on to and change others into is not so special and can be traced back to the influence of other people. And it's those guiding thoughts of mankind or influences that seek to claim our attention and support that we must deny as ultimates. It is those false kings that seek to command us that we must lose or sacrifice on a cross. Now, I think it's important to recognize a few things about self-denial, a few things that self-denial is not. Self-denial does not mean you hate yourself. Self-denial does not mean you harm yourself. Self-denial does not mean you should have low self-esteem. Self-denial does not mean give up caring about your personal health. The self that we must deny is the self that is determined by things created by the mind of man. The desires, intentions, beliefs, and hopes that mankind creates, follows, buys into, that drive our decisions and choices and lifestyle, that take the place of God in our lives. In my opinion, this is why prayer is such a powerful tool. Prayer is all about realignment. It can be done anywhere at any time, and it always changes you. It always pushes your mind to pause, reconsider, or at the very least dampen the selfish impulses that can quickly take over. Okay, so the denial side of this equation strips you of your false identity, the fake you, the masks or characters that you play to look a certain way or be a certain person. The second part of verse 34 and the second part of 35 then describe what it looks like to put on the new identity or find the real you. Let me read them again. If anyone would come after me, let him deny himself, take up his cross and follow me. For whoever would save his life will lose it. But whoever loses his life for my sake and the gospel's will save it. So these verses put it two different ways. It says we must take up our cross and follow Jesus. And it says that those who lose their life for my sake and the gospel's will save it. And the way I want to summarize this is this way. The real you is found by following the real King. The real you is found by following the real King. Once you're willing to deny yourself or give up your selfish ambitions, then you must follow Jesus, the real king, and let him be the example for your life, the power behind your life, and the guide in front of your life. Once we do this, then we discover our true selves in Jesus, who is the key to unlocking our true personality. The disciples in our passage got to literally follow or walk behind Jesus, but we get the benefit of reading about the whole life of Jesus and then getting to live out under the guidance and strength of Jesus. And as we allow God to be at the center of our being, then all of our underlying reasons for doing things change. And the way we view the world transforms, and you discover the real you, because the real you is only found by following the real king. Now here's the interesting thing. On the surface level, I would think that if everyone followed the same person or leader, that then we would all start to look the same. But the neat thing is, with Jesus, that in him, we find the real you, and that person is unique. Each of us is different, even though we often wish we looked, acted like, or sounded like somebody else. God throws out the design every time he makes a new person. And when we discover our real selves, what happens is that God accentuates the things that make us unique. And that is a beautiful thing to watch. This is partly why I think Jesus refers to himself as salt. Salt is a flavor enhancer. Put it on meat, vegetables, whatever. It brings out the flavor. And that's what happens to us when you follow the real king. He enhances and brings out the real you. This is one of my favorite things about the church. It's one of the few institutions that finds value in all ages, all races, men, women, all languages, and all abilities. We share one faith that is portrayed in unique ways by each person. The mind of mankind really only has a few things it goes after: power, wealth, status. But the mind of God has much bigger goals that we get to be a part of and get to be a unique piece in solving. Things like peace, reconciliation, compassion, joy, caring for the poor. The people around you all of a sudden become opportunities to be Jesus towards them. The words you use become opportunities to be kind or compassionate. The things you spend your money on become opportunities to promote peace or show you care. The way you view your body moves to a temple of God's Spirit. Dick Woodward, who I mentioned earlier, used to always call his workouts temple maintenance because of that truth. The kingdom values we have been studying this summer become your values because the real you is found by following the real king. The way you think transformed from the mind of man to the mind of Christ. Now, the Gospel of Luke's version, my favorite version, of this same passage adds one word that I think is a key piece of what this transformation looks like. It says this in Luke 9:23. If anyone would come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross daily and follow me. The key additional word is daily. And I've always found this to be super helpful because it's a reminder that on this side of heaven, the struggle is real when it comes to denying ourselves, picking up our cross, and following Jesus. So just take it one day at a time. And start small if you need to, but start today. For example, one of the things we like to do in our family that has helped us with this daily idea is to ask a few questions regularly around the dinner table. We have some family values we created after a small group study we did years ago, and we have them hung on the wall. And the 4 values are kindness, generosity, thankfulness, and hardworking, and they're tied to Bible verses. And we'll ask each other things like, where did you get to be kind today? Or when was someone kind to you? Or where did you get to be generous or have to work hard? These are values based on the mind of Christ. And the daily act of asking about them has helped us reinforce them and build them into our daily habits. These become moments to celebrate where we saw Jesus in others and ourselves. So I ask again the question that Dick Woodward asked me and many others. Who are you? Are you ready to discover the real you that can be found by following the real king? To help illustrate this, I asked a couple people that I know who have recently been discovering the real you in their lives. And they've begun answering this question, who are you, in new ways. And I asked them, how has submitting to God led to discovering who the real you is? The first one is Aiden, who read the scripture I've gotten to know recently, says this: it was in my brokenness that I began to follow Jesus more closely. And during that time of deep hurt, he started growing me into the person he created me to be. When we follow Jesus, we become more like him, forgiving one another easier, gaining the ability to let go of bitterness, and loving people you didn't think were possible, because the man we follow promises us glory from our sufferings. I like how Aiden says we become more like Jesus, which does not mean Aiden loses his individuality, but it does mean he takes on the kingdom values and gets to see things like gaining the ability to let go of bitterness. What a cool thing. Another friend of mine who's more my age said this in response to my question. For me, my journey of self-discovery was more self-led than Lord-led. It took some drastic life events in my family to break me out of that. After a year on this new path, every step I take now leads me closer to finding the real me. Ultimately, submitting to God's will brings a deep sense of peace and fulfillment, knowing that we are living in alignment with his plan for our lives. This inner peace is a hallmark of discovering and embracing the real you in God's eyes. Trust me when I say that this guy's life has been anything but peaceful over the past year, and yet he has experienced a sense of peace about who he is and who he is becoming. Following Jesus and discovering the real you does not mean life will be easy. Definitely doesn't mean you get what you want, but it does mean you will get to become the unique person God created you to be and participate in the unique gospel work God has for you. If you have never allowed Jesus to be the one that defines the answer to that question, then I would encourage you, give it a try, and we would love to come alongside you as you do it. If you would say that you do follow the real king, that is Jesus, then I want to remind you that Luke's version of this passage says that we must pick up our cross daily and follow him. Self-denial is a daily act, one that we will never stop doing. And so I challenge you to get honest about where you might still be seeking to gain the whole world, and at the same time might be forfeiting pieces of your soul. And then let Jesus into those areas of your life. In closing, I just wanted to offer a couple resources to anyone that would like them. My mentor, as I mentioned, was a guy named Dick Woodward, our pastor emeritus, and I loved his booklets he made. One of them is a booklet called A Prescription for Yourself. We still have some copies. I don't know, there's 20 or so out in the lobby, the foyer there, if you'd like to grab one. And it's titled Prescription for Yourself, subtitle, Who Are You? And he looks at this question, kind of just does a quick analysis of the word self throughout the Bible that I really like. And for those of you who are more on the techie side like me, I did put a link on the Chapel app this morning. It's called A Spiritual Compass. It's a kind of shortened version of one of his books that looks at 8 important questions that God asks you. And one of them is, who are you? So you can just get that right on the app if you'd like to. But as we head out this morning, I pray that wherever you are, we would be willing to admit our selfishness, deny ourselves, and realize the real you is found by following the real King. Thank you for joining us today. Here at the Williamsburg Community Chapel, we are all about making disciples of Jesus Christ. So wherever you are on your spiritual journey, we hope you will join us this summer as the Gospel of Mark teaches us that Jesus is the King and how his life initiates a new kingdom.